excited too to have a lot of fresh faces to see the research that I've been doing for a very long time. But I'll be presenting also study 2 data, which is really exciting for me, about socioeconomic status background and whether you can really escape the effects of how you were raised and what sort of economic situation you were raised in. So I want you to meet Tim and Matt. And Tim and Matt are freakishly similar, right? They like the same sports, they like the same movies, have the same interests. They're both sophomores in college. They have the same major. But there's one really important difference between Tim and Matt. Tim grew up poor. And what does that mean, grew up poor? Well, you can ask a lot of different researchers on income inequality what that means, and there are a lot of different definitions. And we can look at sort of objective measures of socioeconomic status. We can look at federal guidelines like the poverty threshold. But interestingly, measurements like the poverty threshold, which is a calculation that the government uses to place people under a certain line in census data, has been called outdated, unrealistic, and nonsensical. And if we also consider students at the university as being below the poverty threshold, there would be very few of them. And it would be practically impossible for me to run any study on students who are from below the poverty line because there are so few at university usually. So when I talk about poverty or growing up poor, I'm considering what poverty experts and researchers often use, which is 200% the poverty line as a more accurate threshold for poverty. And that's usually between $45,000 and $50,000 a year as a household income for an average-sized family. Marie?
I heard this morning on NPR that 4 times the poverty level is 46,000 because 11,000 is the poverty level.
That would be for one person.
I see.
Yeah, this is for
family.
5 or 6 people, average,
Okay.
4 or 5 people, average-sized family, at $45,000 to $50,000. And that number decreases or increases depending on how many people are in your family. There's also a subjective measure of how you grew up. Do you feel like you grew up poor when you were growing up? Or do you feel like you grew up wealthy? Do you feel like you grew up middle class? How do you feel you grew up? And so we can use the MacArthur scale of subjective socioeconomic status to ask people how they feel they grew up, where they felt like they grew up on basically the ladder. It's called the ladder. And so the MacArthur scale is set up for individuals now. How do you rate yourself now? How would you say you compare to other people in the United States? On a 1 to 10 sort of scale. So I just basically changed that here in the instructions from where would you place yourself on this ladder to where would you place your family, or where did your family stand financially compared to other persons in the United States when you were growing up. So how was your family, what was your family socioeconomic status compared to others when you were growing up? So it's important to note that this is a relative sort of question, and if somebody was, lived in a poor inner city community and their family made $45,000, they may feel pretty wealthy compared to their peers. Somebody who grew up in a wealthy community in Rhode Island or Connecticut or something who makes $45,000 may feel relatively poor compared to their peers. So it was important for me to get at both objective and subjective measures of socioeconomic status background to get an idea, that they were objectively poor, sort of if you look at this 200% poverty level, but also felt subjectively poor at the same time. So it was, for me, in this research, I used a combination of both measures. So let's talk again about Tim, who grew up poor, and then also Matt, who grew up wealthy, because a lot of income inequality research just compares people who grew up poor to people who grew up wealthy, and there's sort of this bipolar dichotomy, and sort of forget everyone in the middle, which is a problem with research about income inequality, but it exists. So just wanted to talk about that, and say that unfortunately for Tim, growing up poor, independent of his current status, they're both sophomores in college, they could be, have the same job as adults, independent of their current status, adults who grew up poor are more likely to have heart disease, they're more likely to have hypertension or develop hypertension, to have depression, and they have worse responses to stress, so they get sort of more physiologically aroused to stress than those who grew up wealthy. So Tim is going to have a lot more negative health outcomes than Matt. Also, unfortunately for Tim, class of origin has been found to be the best predictor of adult educational and occupational achievement, despite our belief to the contrary and our adherence to the myth of class permeability. So there really isn't this American dream that everyone thinks is happening. There's really not the opportunities to get ahead in the United States like a lot of people think there is. Usually where you're born is where you're going to stay, or you're going to go up a little bit, and it's not going to be a lot. You're not going to go from one extreme to the other. There might be a little bit of movement, but not a lot. So individuals from low SES backgrounds are less likely to attend college. They're less likely to attend selective institutions if they do go to college. They're less likely to graduate. They're less likely to graduate in 4 years, so it tends to be more expensive for them to go to school. They're less likely to attend graduate school. They're less, and this is true, I could go on and on, but this is true for qualified students. These researchers have controlled for SAT scores and grades. These students could be going to these selective universities, but they're choosing not to. So just to get a visual, if you're from the top income quartile, you have above a 50% or about a 50% chance of getting a college degree by the time you turn 24. If you're from the next income quartile down, you have a 1 in 3 shot of earning a college degree before turning 24. If you're from the third or the second to bottom income quartile, that sort of middle, second to bottom income quartile, you have a 1 in 10 chance. So it drops from a 33% chance to a 10% chance. And then if you're from the bottom income quartile, you have a 1 in 17 chance of earning a college degree before you turn 24. So why is this? So a lot of people say, maybe they're just can't afford it. And researchers have found that no, when you offer free education at these selective universities, they won't take it. They'll go to community colleges. They'll go to local universities. Why? Why won't they take this free education at these top schools? And it's a problem that these top schools are struggling with. These selective institutions are trying to get income diversity or economic diversity in their schools, but it's not working. And so I feel like one mechanism may be stereotype threat or fear of confirming stereotypes as these students enter college or are in college and are afraid of confirming negative stereotypes about their group from growing up poor. And college is one very sure way to activate some of the stereotypes that come up when we talk about low-income communities. And these stereotypes may have real implications or have been found to have real implications for health, well-being, and performance. And so I wanted to talk about this before I get into stereotypes. I wanted to talk about some of the real implications for stereotype threat. This is a well-known study by Blaskovich and colleagues about stereotype threat in African American males. And so he brought in 19 African Americans, 19 European Americans, 20 African Americans, and had them interact with either a European American professor or an African American professor. Those European American professors said, I'm going to give you a test and it's going to measure your intellectual performance. And so it was activating stereotype threat, saying, I'm going to test you, an African American who's been stereotyped as because of your group status as being less intellectual, or an African American professor says, I'm just going to see if we can create a culturally unbiased test for you. So as you can see, mean arterial pressure, which is a measure of blood pressure that I'll talk about a little bit later, increased significantly for those African American individuals with a European American professor in this high stereotype threat group. And he measured mean arterial pressure, and he also measured performance on a RAT task, which is the Remote Associates task, which I'll also talk about later. But I just wanted to mention that this is why I'm using the measures I'm using. This is the inspiration for the study, because yes, there's this stereotype threat activation, but there's also this inequality activation. When a student who's African American is interacting with a Caucasian American professor versus an African American professor who may be perceived as sort of more equal in status. So what are some possible stereotypes about Tim's family, his poor family? Feel free to play the devil's advocate here.
Lazy.
Lazy.
Uneducated.
Uneducated.
Poorly dressed.
Huh?
Poorly dressed.
Poorly dressed, yeah.
Disorganized.
Disorganized. Great examples. And we found that, researchers found that the poor are labeled as, there's Tim and his family. The poor are labeled as unhealthy, dumb, lazy, but also responsible for their position as poor. You are responsible for being in the position you were in. You didn't work hard enough. You're not sort of smart enough and working to be smart enough to be in a different position. And unfortunately, this prejudice against, or stereotypes against the poor increase as education increases. So the more educated you are, the more negative stereotypes are going to feel towards the poor, which is unique in that most prejudice goes down as education goes up. This is one of the few that goes up as education goes up. And so you can see that, in college we're increasing education, so college may be an especially unwelcoming or uncomfortable environment as these people are becoming more educated and potentially more biased against the poor and the families of those individuals who are coming from that background. So just consider the experiences of someone at one of the top 250 most selective US colleges and universities, where only 3%, around 3% of the student population is from the lowest income quartile. That's 3 in 100 people at the most the most selective, 250 most selective colleges and universities. So we have 3 people out of 100. You can already feel that it's probably a little bit isolating. It's a little bit awkward. They may have some particular experiences that may be sort of strange. But you also have to consider that because of these stereotypes of their families, because of sort of the unique aspect of being able to conceal the fact that they come from these families, may also create a unique experience where they feel social pressure to conceal their socioeconomic status background in order to potentially avoid those negative stereotypes about their group membership. So instead of looking like this, it'll probably look a little bit more like this for those individuals. They don't really have a close group membership. They can't easily find people who are like them, like people from racial minorities may easily be able to find people who are like them, start talking about their shared experiences. If there are people from low SES backgrounds around, usually you don't know it because they're sort of encouraged or perhaps feel pressure to hide or conceal that group membership. And this may lead to feelings of isolation. We know that social support or in-group membership increases self-esteem. It does all of these great things. And if you can't find people who are like you, can't get that social support, then it's going to lead to some negative consequences. But you're also more likely to find yourself potentially in uncomfortable situations when socializing with people from higher SES backgrounds. And what do I mean by that? It's sort of these microaggressions, these sort of things that you may not know how to questions you may not know how to answer. So if somebody's talking about the time they backpacked through Europe, it may be a little difficult to have a shared experience with that. If they ask you where you went to summer camp and you didn't go to summer camp, how do you answer that question? Do you come up with an answer? Do you, admit that you didn't go to summer camp because your family couldn't afford it? Do you want to go to dinner with us at this expensive restaurant? Potentially, you won't be able to afford that social experience. We're going to my parents' other house. Where did you get those shoes? If you have to answer Goodwill or Walmart, you might feel some anxiety about those answers or feeling like you have to come up with another answer. So these cross-class interactions may lead to feelings of isolation or feelings like you don't belong in that environment, what Lott and Bullock call income-related embarrassment. It may also lead to feelings of guilt for leaving your family or a desire to return to them. You want to go back to your in-group who won't laugh at your Goodwill shoes, that won't ask you to do things that you're uncomfortable doing or can't afford to do. So you may want to go back to your family, and research has found that students from low socioeconomic status backgrounds tend to have a more interdependent focus. So they want to be a part of a group. They feel like they should contribute to others and help others, whereas people from higher SES backgrounds have a more independent focus. So there are those feelings like I want to go back, but there's the opposite side of the coin, which is this desire to distance yourself from your background or your family, and they may never visit home. They may not talk to their family anymore because it's they want to distance themselves from that group who's has all of these negative stereotypes. So I'm interested in what happens during those interactions, when we're getting to know someone's socioeconomic status background, when we have those awkward social situations. So what happens when Tim meets Matt and they start talking about their SES background, or it gets brought up? So my research goals were to find out whether simply interacting with someone from a higher SES background could cause physiological stress, which is measured in the same way Blaskovich measured physiological stress using MAP, which is 2 times the diastolic plus systolic values divided by 3. And that's because we spend 2/3 of our cycle in diastolic and then 1/3 in systolic. And an average MAP is 93.33 for 120/80. And also, will that affect performance on a task? And I chose to use the same task as Blaskovich, the remote associates task, for individuals from those low status backgrounds. So again, I just wanted to remind you that's where I got, using MAP and using the RAPs from this Blaskovich paper. So my specific hypotheses were that individuals from lower SES backgrounds, when interacting with someone from those higher backgrounds, will experience a rise in mean arterial pressure after they realize they're in an unequal sort of situation, and they'll perform worse on the remote associates test. And I measured performance using number correct, but also failure to respond. So, just sitting there and not choosing to answer the question. Compared to those interacting with someone from a similar background or when status isn't made salient. So in study 1, I had 61 European Americans to get rid of those race confounds, ages 18 to 24, only individuals from low SES backgrounds, which are people who reported a family income of less than or equal to $50,000 a year, and a subjective socioeconomic status background below the midpoint of the ladder. So we had individuals come in to the lab. They were hooked up to all the physiological equipment. This is a picture of the blood pressure machine that we use in our lab, which is really awesome. You just slip it onto the fingers and have a cuff, and it measures blood pressure continuously. So we let participants hang out for 5 minutes, and then we started the status disclosure task, which I basically came up with based on an experience that I had at a job training when I worked for the Upward Bound program. And we're going to go through it so that you can sort of see what it feels like. If you have a pen or pencil in front of you, you can sort of choose to reveal or disclose your socioeconomic status background. So if you put it in the middle of your desk, and then move your pen or pencil up if you had a car in high school. And move your pencil down if you had to have a job in high school to help support your family. Move your pen or pencil up if your parents had a second home or summer home when you were growing up. Move your pen or pencil up or down if you attended move your pencil up if you attended a private school. Move your pencil down if you qualified for free or reduced hot lunch in school. Move your pen or pencil up if you attended a camp in the summer when you were growing up. Move your pencil down if your parents live or lived paycheck to paycheck when you were growing up. Move your pencil down if you attended college completely dependent on financial aid. And so what happened, that we have a series of questions during the status manipulation, but what happened during my work training was that there were people pressed against the wall because they had to take a step forward if these things applied to them, or a step back if you were from a low SES background. People who were from a high status background their faces were to the wall, which was a little bit uncomfortable for them, but a little bit more uncomfortable for the people in the back of the room who were looking around and seeing two people in the room and sort of felt pretty awkward about the situation. And you may, feel awkward yourself if your pen fell off the front of your desk or, fell into your lap because you grew up, relatively wealthier or poorer than other people around you. But another important thing is that you can see what other people are like around you and compare your background to others and realize that maybe it was a little bit different. So in my study, the status disclosure task uses poker chips. They're given 6 poker chips to start with, and they have a bank of poker chips. And so we ask questions, a series of questions that you've heard. If there were more than 50 books in your home when you were growing up, take a chip from the bowl, from the bank. And if they did that, they'd hear auditory feedback, a cha-ching noise. Basically, you got money, you got a coin. And if there were a series of discard questions. So please discard if there were abandoned houses near your home when you were growing up. And if they placed a coin back in the bank, then they heard auditory feedback of a kaplunk. And it's not supposed to sound sad, but it is a little bit sad when these low-income students basically get rid of all of their chips, and they have maybe 3 chips in front of them. Yeah.
Where do you get these queries?
The questions?
Yeah.
It was from the task that we did at the job in my job training. It's called the line of inequality, and I developed those questions into this manipulation. And so not only were they hearing the feedback about their own status, they were also hearing feedback from their partner. So at the beginning of the study, we told them your partner 1 and your partner is partner 2. They waved hello to their partner to sort of make it more believable. And after each status disclosure question, partner 1 was asked to answer, and then partner 2 was asked to answer. And then the experimenter would take the role as partner 2. So they would either take chips if the partner was supposed to be higher status, or they would discard chips if the partner was supposed to be lower status. So for the higher status partner, we took all of the chips. We discarded 1 because early on in a pilot, we found that if you didn't discard 1, they thought the noise was broken. It just didn't work. So we have to make the noise once so that they believe that it exists. And the opposite for the lower income partner, we discarded an all, took on 1, so they knew that the sound worked. And there was a no status control condition where we asked random questions. Please discard 1 chip if you've ever broken a bone. Please take 1 chip if you've ever met someone famous. It was the same amount of questions. The take and discard questions were in the same order. And we treated it like the rich condition, so we took on all items but discarded on. And just to see the manipulation check, or where they placed themselves and their partner on these tasks, we asked them to place an X on the ladder where you would place yourself or your family when growing up, and place your partner where their family were when they were growing up. The ladder goes from 1 to 10. You can see on the y-axis, and then we have yourself, so you as a participant, in the no status, lower status, and higher status conditions, and then the confederate, so your partner in the no status, lower status, and higher status conditions. So how did they rate themselves? They were around or below the midpoint of the ladder in this study, and no significant difference between groups. How would they rate their partner? Basically, they said that the no status and low status condition were basically the same as them, but in the high status condition was higher. And this is significant. I just didn't put the dot. But there was a significant difference between those groups. So they did perceive their high status partner as being higher status. So after their task, their status disclosure task, they did this manipulation check. They waited around for a couple of minutes, and then we started the remote associates test, which in study 1 included 14 items. So they would hear the words rabbit, cloud, and house, and they would be asked to think of the word that is best associated with those 3 words. So what would the answer be in this example? I've given you a really nice hint with the pictures. White would be the correct answer for that. How about broken, clear, and eye? Glass, yes. Broken glass, clear glass, and glass eye. How about high, wheel, and rocking? Chair, yes. And how about boot, summer, and ground? Camp, right. The first 2 are in the 14 rat items for study 1. This third is in the second rat that we used. And so you can see it's difficult, not impossible, but also kind of stressful trying to think of these words for these participants. So after we did this 5-minute rat task, we had a 5-minute recovery where they just sort of were hanging out after the study. So we looked at mean arterial blood pressure, like Blaskovich did. In this case, I'm just going to show you the average map, or the mean arterial blood pressure, which, remember, the average was 93, but our blood pressure machines aren't calibrated to be accurate. We're just looking at changes. So it's not medical grade, so just keep that in mind. And we have the baseline, the status disclosure, rat, and recovery. So the mean of those, the mean of the minutes. So we have a 5-minute baseline, mean together, 6-minute disclosure task, mean together, 5 minutes, 5 minutes, and we'll just comparing those means. So in the no status condition, there was basically no difference over time. They were just basically chill the whole time they were there. No difference in any of the times. Interestingly, for those in the lower status or with a matched income partner, their MAP actually went down significantly during the stress task. So they were sort of more relaxed than they were to begin with during the stressor. And then, looking at those with a higher status partner, we have a pretty significant increase in blood pressure during the status disclosure, during the rat task, and the recovery. So these are different from the lower status and higher status groups, but the status disclosure isn't significantly different from baseline. And actually, the rat isn't significantly different from baseline either. The recovery is significantly higher than baseline, so there was an significant increase in MAP over time. We can also graph it looking at reactivity, which is how Blaskovich graphed his blood pressure data. We're looking at each minute of the task. So this is the status disclosure task compared to baseline. This is the rat task compared to baseline, and recovery compared to baseline. And you can see that for individuals in the high status condition, their reactivity was going up and up. And I think it's really interesting to look at this graph compared to Blaskovich's graph for those in the stereotype threat condition. Interestingly, though, The y-axis for Blaskovich went from -5 to 5, and my y-axis is going from -14 to 16. So it's a little bit stronger of a reaction during the stressor. How about performance? You can see that individuals in this study did kind of awful on the rat test. There was a pretty bad floor effect. There were 14 items. The average for each condition was around 2 items. So we tested this test with our RAs, and they had no problem with any of the items. Maybe a couple we added that were really hard. But for some reason, our rat test was just kind of too hard for these participants to do well, which stinks, but we corrected for it hopefully in the second study. Interestingly, though, we did look at failure to respond, and individuals in the higher status condition were less likely to respond than those in the lower status condition. So they were sort of less confident, or looked sort of less confident, felt sort of less confident in their answers or willingness to answer during the rat task. So as hypothesized, participants in the higher SES partner condition did show a significant increase in MAP, and that significant increase from baseline was in the recovery for those participants with a higher status background. And that's really important because stress reactivity in recovery has been found to have a number of negative health consequences for people who are still reacting to stress when they're supposed to not be. They're supposed to be calm, they're supposed to be coming down from that stress, and these participants are still stressed out. Participants in the higher SES partner condition also showed less willingness to respond during the rat task, which we'll take as a measure of less performance. But maybe we don't want to see that they're doing worse on the actual number that they get right. We don't really want to show that being around someone who's wealthy is going to make you perform worse. I don't know, we'll get there, I guess. So important questions to ask. And also there was a floor effect on that rat, which kind of stinks. A few reasons why that might be, and also we have a few questions that we have unanswered, which gets us into wondering what would Matt's reaction be to a cross-class interaction. So Matt grew up wealthy, and so we were curious about what his reaction would be when we started study 2. So our hypotheses for study 2 were that performance and physiological reactivity of those from higher SES backgrounds would not be impacted negatively during cross-class interactions or during any interaction. And that's based on the Blaskovich paper that showed that those Caucasian Americans who were participating with an African American professor showed no real reaction to that interaction. So we're thinking sort of in-group, out-group situations and what would happen based on that. We also predicted to continue to see negative performance or worse performance on the rat and more physiological reactivity effects for those from low SES backgrounds with a high SES partner. So we're going to try to replicate what we found in study 1 in our study 2. So study 2 participants, we have 164. I ran the last participant last Monday, so a week ago, which was very exciting. There were 83 participants from low SES backgrounds and 81 participants from high SES backgrounds. I don't have means yet because I haven't matched the pre-screen data to this data yet, so I'll have that soon, hopefully. But what is high SES background? And there are the same issues that come with defining low SES background. But in our sample, we used people who self-reported a family income of equal to or more than $125,000 a year. And that was basically the second to top option in our scale. So we were basically using those who felt that they were high enough in our scale. And also a subjective SES background of 6 or above, so they're above that midpoint on the ladder, MacArthur ladder. The baseline, the methods for the study 2 were basically the same especially up to the status disclosure task and the rest period even, they were basically the same. They did the 5-minute baseline, they met their partner in the same way. And we can see manipulation check, subjective socioeconomic status of the self, so how you rated yourself on the ladder. We'll look at those in lower SES participants versus higher SES participants. We want to see that lower SES participants are rating themselves lower than higher SES participants on a 1 to 10 scale. So in this study, you'll notice that we used a lower, I guess I didn't show that. Sorry, we used a lower cutoff, so we used $40,000 instead of $50,000 because of some of the concerns that have been raised in previous prosems and things like that. So I ended up using a lower income cutoff, so this may explain why the subjective status for these participants is a little bit lower than in the first study. It's around a 4 on the ladder. And those in the high status, or from high status backgrounds, were around a 7, or 6.5 to a 7. So there was this difference between lower status and higher status participants. How about status, perceived status of the partner? So we have these low SES participants in a no status, lower status, or higher status condition. And basically, we found what we wanted to find, I guess, that these lower status participants in a low status condition were rating their partner as lower status, significantly lower than those in higher status in the control. And you'll probably, I don't know if you'll remember, but this is different than the previous study. In the last study, they thought the control condition were the same status as them. We think maybe it's because they start lower status, so comparatively they think the control might be higher, but also because a lot of these participants in the control condition aren't reporting their partner's SES. They say, I don't know, because I didn't find out. There were no questions about socioeconomic status, so I don't feel comfortable guessing what their socioeconomic status is. So the N decreases pretty significantly in this group. And in the higher status, for those who are from higher status backgrounds, they rated their partner as lower status, significantly lower than in the no status or higher status conditions. So up to that point, it's basically the same, but we had those issues with the remote associates test. So what did I do to sort of fix the issue? I made it a little bit longer, trying to get a little bit more variability in the measure. So I added 4 questions. I also broke it up into easy, medium, and hard items, which is more similar to the Blaskovich paper. I thought I was just using easy items in the first study, but come to find out they weren't so easy. And so I was much more focused in making sure that I got these very easy, medium, and hard items in the second study. So an example of an easy item might be tag, kennel, and food. The answer is dog. And most people are getting that question right. Not all of them, but most people get that question right. We also added a visual component. So instead of just listing off the words through an audio system, we also had a PowerPoint. We would present one word, and then the second word, and then the third word, and they would have this present while they were trying to guess the word. So can anybody think of the answer for this? Sauce, tree, and pie? Apple, yes. We also did give credit to one person who said cherry, because there is cherry sauce, which I didn't realize existed when I made the rat. But we do give credit for cherry. So it has a visual component, and it has increased performance on the task. As you can see, they're getting between 9 and 10 questions right, 8 and 10 questions right on the task. Unfortunately, you can also see that there's really no difference between any of the conditions on performance when we look at number correct. So maybe it's fortunate, maybe it's good that these students aren't performing worse even though they're with a high income partner. And also, I think it's important to consider that these are college students who may be used to these interactions and have shown that they're effective and not letting their performance suffer because they're in college and are performing well enough to be in college. So maybe they're practiced in this skill, and it would be interesting to look at a community sample for these effects. Excitingly, though, we did replicate this failure to respond question. So participants from low status backgrounds with a high status partner were less likely to respond during the RAT task. Less likely to respond than those in the lower status partner condition and in the no status partner condition. And it's interesting to think about why that might be. You can see on their face that they want to be sure before they answer the question. They want to make sure that they're right before embarrassing themselves and being, sort of wrong. And so, as an observation, I sort of make while I'm running the studies, but also something that the RAs have told me when they're correcting these videos, that you can really tell when somebody's not comfortable answering until they know that they're correct. So the next step is going to be to look at the difficulty of the question and hoping to replicate Blaskovich's finding, which was that African Americans only did worse in the high stereotype threat condition when the items were difficult. So I'm going to look at that next, I guess. I have a lot to look at. Physiological data do I have to do. But this is interesting, that we're replicating this effect that those lower status participants don't feel as comfortable answering in the high status condition. And there may also be an in-group effect that is responsible for some of the stuff going on. There's a 3-item scale that I used for sort of in-group-ness, or how much your partner is like you. 3 questions, my partner and I are very similar, my partner and I have things in common, I think my partner is very much like me. Those lower status participants with a low status partner thought their partner was more like them. It makes sense that this would be true. And those in the higher status, who are from higher status backgrounds with a higher status partner, are rating their partner more like them than the low status partner. So there may be this in-group, out-group stuff going on that may be responsible for some of this stress. What are some implications for the future, or some future directions? One is that these one-on-one cross-status interactions may be stressful, but only for those from low-status backgrounds. And what does that mean? What does that mean for students in college? What does that mean for retention or graduation rates? And how can we improve those retention and graduation rates? One may be the implication. One direction may be those implications of low-status people from low status backgrounds as a protective in-group. So we saw in study 1 the physio going down, sort of that stress reactivity going down during the stressor for individuals low in SES with a low SES partner. Maybe there's a protective factor there. And we also saw this, more willingness to guess, this more willingness to put yourself out there for individuals with a lower status partner. And some universities are using this already. So I know at Colby College, there is a group for students from low status backgrounds and faculty members from low status backgrounds to sort of get together and be their own group, which is really nice for those students. Before, I remember going before, and they sort of formed their own core club, they called it, which was really interesting to think that they were searching each other out and trying to find similar others, which is true to my experiences too. And I also, upward bound, things like that, studies that I've presented before about in-group support and increasing social support through in-group membership. And that's it. I sort of rushed, so I'm sorry. Yeah, Cindy?
So I thought you did a great job, and it was a very interesting presentation, and I loved your graphics,
Thanks.
by the way, a lot of cartoonish figures. As you were talking, I was wondering a little bit about people who basically might have a double whammy against them, that both being from a low-income family and being a racial minority, or some other kind of minority, and some of those things are more visible than others. And I know, obviously, having collected data at the University of Maine, you have a primarily Caucasian sample, so it is mostly Caucasians. But did you have any impressions of that, or sort of just general thought based on your
Yeah.
knowledge?
I mean, I've definitely come across it a lot in the research that I'm doing for my dissertation. It's interesting because a lot of times ethnic minorities at universities come from higher status backgrounds, and that's how they've sort of overcome a lot of those structural issues. And so a majority of ethnic minorities are going to be from higher status backgrounds, but to think about those ethnic minorities who are from low status backgrounds as a double whammy, I think, is the right way to think about it, that they're going to have these issues from being in a minority group that's obvious and being from a minority group that isn't so much, and how to sort of deal with those issues. There's another direction towards sexual orientation and low status background, and basically everyone's thinking these are great questions and we need to start studying them, but we haven't yet. So we're all where you are, I think, when it comes to income equality research. How do these group memberships, numerous group memberships, affect our outcomes, for sure. Jordan?
Is there any indication that maybe those multiple group memberships might provide a protective effect for some of these effects too, right? They might draw in-group identity from those minority groups,
Yes, for sure.
but probably not from this group.
No, and I think that's where I think that it's interesting to think about Caucasian Americans who are low status because they can't easily form those groups, those social support groups, when they don't have another group membership that may be protective, and those minorities who can form group memberships that they may be protective, for sure. It's also, I was talking about sexual orientation too, and it's interesting theory that sexual orientation is treated as sort of a higher status, or people who are from sexual minorities tend to be associated with higher status, socioeconomic status, interestingly. And so there may be this sort of buffer effect because of this group membership that allows them to feel they're from a higher status because of that. But these are all really great questions that there's not a whole lot of research about, and I'm really hoping to get there, and even to replicate the Blaskovich study with just race differences and not the stereotype threat manipulation, because I think there's a confound when it comes to that study.
I was thinking about when Jordan said protective factors, and I'm sorry, this is a stereotype, but just thinking, for example, of some African American students whose ticket to college can be athletic ability. So on the one hand, they might have those socioeconomic factors working against them, but have that kind of social group, not only the peer group, but academic support services for athletes and different kind, and it's kind of a different status. They're especially a successful athlete, and they're getting all this, the accolades, and so that kind of factor.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and also if you've seen that video of African American students or African American males at UCLA that just came out, there's a really great video that a student from UCLA, African American male student from UCLA came out that had statistics about African American males at UCLA, and basically 65% of those students were athletes, student athletes, and the rest of them felt like a very different group, which I think is interesting, that these 65% do have these support systems, but this other group of us don't really. And I think the number of African American males coming into UCLA that year was like 32 total. It represented 3% of the population, which is similar to low SES students at these very selective universities. So I think it's a great point to think of them as sort of separate, and I almost think that they may think of themselves as sort of separate within a university.
Continuing on the racial side of this talk, I had the experience of teaching Africans as opposed to African Americans. When they were college students, I was teaching them tropical agriculture, which I did very well. But that's okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, they were very interactive. They were very willing to ask questions or make comments, and as a group. And you could probably think of that as some kind of home field advantage. They were comfortable. And I didn't make them uncomfortable. And since then, African Americans in my classes there's 2 or 1. And I've made it a point, if they ever do ask a question, to really be responsive. And you can reinforce that. And now I have, for example, an African American female student who's asking questions and making comments all the time. So I think you can make some effort to break apart these inhibitions that you demonstrated in failure to respond, part of the study. I also have a question for you on SES, which really ought not to be confounded with race or ethnicity, but often is. If you think of SES as a continuous variable, and you cut that in half, high, low, you're putting in opposite groups individuals who are very similar in SES. And so if that's the case, I would suggest pulling out the extremes and comparing them. And if you had a pre-measure, right, you could have a stratified random sample where you only have an equivalent, but much smaller number of mid-SES who make up the majority, right? And then equal numbers of low and high. You might get a little better statistical effect.
Well, we are using sort of stratified sampling in that we're only using people who are under $45,000 and above $125,000, and there's that,
And
middle.
you've left out the middle.
Yes.
Okay. I didn't
And
catch
we
that.
also left out everyone who reported a 5 on the ladder. And it is definitely an interest of mine to study those middle class or people who really identify as middle class as a sample, especially because I ran one accidentally once. They had the same name as someone else, and so I emailed the wrong person. It was a middle initial sort of thing. And she was with a low-income partner and was very mean to her, called her the S word, S-L-U-T word afterwards. And I wonder if there was this sort of fear of being identified with this group and willing or need or want to separate yourself from that group as a middle-class American. That idea that you as a middle-class person may be more likely to derogate the poor Americans because you don't want to be associated with them. And so I'm very interested in studying that group, but it's just sort of beyond this. It took me 2 years to collect this data, 3 years to collect all this data. So it's definitely something I'm very interested in. Maybe I'll have to run it before I get out of here anyway. So
Just speculating, since you drew your sample here at the University of Maine, and probably not a representative sample. If you imagine sampling in Chicago or Detroit, do you think you would get somewhat different results?
yes, well, yes and no. I think it's really interesting to think about urban and rural experiences, urban and rural poor experiences. I think they're very different, and I think income researchers are aware of the
Also,
difference.
majority, minority.
Yeah, for sure. And we know that, social psychologists know that being a part of a minority group is going to limit the negative consequences. So if you are overweight and are at a school who has a majority overweight people, you're not going to feel the negative consequences that you would get if you were the only overweight person in that school. So if you were at a school with a number of poor students, a majority of poor students, you may not feel like a minority group at all. And I know that I suspect that's what's going on at sort of these Division 3, that's not what you call it. Sorry, I'm not drawing a blank, but the poor high schools or poor schools are sort of labeled Division Title I, thank you, Title I schools. I think that's what's going on. They have a majority of poor students there, and they're not getting the sort of educational effects that schools that have low number or percentage of poor students would get. So I think it's a great point.
So one way you could continue this program of research is to enlist some collaborators once you work out your method, and then export it into very different contexts within the United States and see what you get.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I would love to do something outside of college students, because I think that to get to college from a low-income, first-generation background takes a lot of something. And I don't know what it is yet, but I think that I'm studying a group of people who have that something that has allowed them to leave their background that 17 other people, 16 other people weren't able to do.
Sometimes it might be something about them, but also someone around them, particularly some mentor, a teacher, military
Yeah.
recruiter.
Yeah, there's this whole research called on shift and persist, about being able to shift your frame of mind and persist thinking positively about your life and your life goals. And if low-income students are able to do that, then they're more successful, but they need those role models to teach them how to do that. And so my third study of my dissertation is about the Upward Bound program and how successful they are at shifting your sort of frame of mind into being more positive and gaining those role models, which I was able to show happened over time, that they had more positive role models in their life after the 6-week program. But there's a lot of problems. There's no comparison group with that study of other similar age high school students, so there's that problem. But definitely interesting to see the impact of a program like that, which is now funded at the University of Maine Classic program. So.
Have time for one more question?
I know Marie had a question a while ago.
Well, I think you kind of answered it. My question was about your baseline and the opportunities there in terms of, with questionnaire or something, characterizing individual differences within both your low income, particularly, and perhaps your high income group. And my second, so for example, you mentioned, what are the individual differences amongst poor people, such as some take this enormous challenge, so you kind of pre-selected that. So I would imagine your baseline anxiety sensitivity and such would be lower than the average poor person that wouldn't take that challenge. So you may get that kind of lack of difference between the groups, because high income would be maybe even more at risk in terms of some of those sensitivities. So it's a complicated sample that's not in the baseline equivalent. So
Right.
you mentioned that. Very interesting.
Well, thanks, Ryan.
Thank you.
And just a quick reminder that you are all always welcome at Prosem. Please join us any Monday you like, 2:10 in the room. Thanks.